My name is Zoey. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I've been known as the reasonable one. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a compliance analyst for a mid-sized healthcare firm, one of those quiet jobs that exist to prevent disasters no one else sees coming. I review patterns, audit records, and flag inconsistencies. I sit in rooms where people assume I'm there to take notes. I rarely correct them. If you met me at a family gathering, you wouldn't think I was the type to dismantle a carefully constructed lie. I don't raise my voice. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate conversations. I ask questions and then I listen. That's usually when people underestimate me. My sister Ava has always been the opposite. Charismatic, emotional, magnetic in the way some people are when they've learned early how to command a room. Growing up, she was the one teachers described as spirited. I was described as steady. She filled the space. I held it. This story isn't about sibling rivalry in the dramatic sense. It's not about shouting matches across a dining table or years of open hostility. It's about something quieter, something that unfolded slowly, behind closed doors, under the polite language of care and concern. It's about our mother. 2 years ago, our mom began showing signs of cognitive decline. Nothing dramatic at first. Misplaced keys, forgotten appointments, stories told twice in one evening. Ava stepped in quickly. She moved closer. She handled medications. She scheduled appointments. She positioned herself as indispensable. At first, I was grateful. Then I noticed patterns, subtle ones. Prescription refills that didn't align. Conversations that felt rehearsed. A version of our mother that seemed sharper when Ava wasn't in the room, and strangely foggier when she was. What I discovered later would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty, about family, and about the line between influence and control. I found out my sister had been drugging our mother to manipulate her into changing the will. But this isn't a revenge story. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic courtroom speeches, no explosive confrontations. What followed was slower than that, colder, more deliberate. Because the inheritance wasn't rewritten by love, it was rewritten by control. And when you realize that someone you grew up with is capable of reshaping reality in silence, you don't scream, you study. Over the next 15 parts, I'm going to tell you exactly how I pieced it together, how I moved without announcing that I was moving, how silence became my strategy, and how the consequences unfolded, not because I sought revenge, but because I refused to participate in a lie. This isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about what happens when the quiet one finally decides to see clearly. Have you ever realized something was wrong long before anyone else was willing to admit it? In my family, I was the bridge. Not the destination, not the decision maker, the bridge. If there was tension, I smoothed it. If there was confusion, I clarified it. If our mother forgot something, I quietly corrected it without embarrassing her. And if Ava needed someone to validate her version of events, I was expected to nod. I learned early that being dependable earns you gratitude, but not authority. Ava was emotional. I was in logistics. When our father passed away 8 years ago, Ava cried openly at the funeral, leaning into relatives' shoulders, accepting their murmured praise for being so strong. I handled the paperwork in the back office of the church, making sure the insurance forms were signed correctly. No one thanked me. They just assumed I'd do it. That assumption followed me into adulthood. At Thanksgiving, Ava told stories. I washed dishes. At the doctor's appointments, Ava asked dramatic questions. I took notes. When our mother began forgetting small things, Ava reacted. I researched. It wasn't resentment, not at first. It was simply the role I occupied. Reliable, useful, invisible. If I expressed concern about something practical, like medication interactions or financial irregularities, Ava would tilt her head slightly and say, "Zoey, you always think the worst. Mom needs comfort, not suspicion." And our mother would nod, because comfort feels warmer than caution. I don't blame her for that. The narrative in our family had always been simple. Ava loved loudly, I loved quietly. Loud love is easier to see. When Mom's memory lapses increased, Ava suggested consolidating all prescriptions under one pharmacy for simplicity. She offered to manage the pill organizer weekly. She volunteered to handle online banking because technology stresses Mom out. Every step made sense in isolation, and I agreed to most of them, because on the surface, Ava looked like a devoted daughter, the one sacrificing her time, the one rearranging her life. I was still working full-time, still structured, still distant in comparison. Relatives began praising her. "She's such a blessing to your mom. You're lucky Ava is so hands-on." Zoey's always been independent. Ava has the nurturing heart. Independent. That word always sounds complimentary, but in our context, it meant optional. When the topic of the will first came up again, casually, during a Sunday dinner, it was Ava who steered the conversation. "Mom, we should make sure everything's updated while you're still sharp," she said gently. Still sharp. It was framed as protection, preparedness, love. I remember watching our mother hesitate, just slightly. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, then smoothed out. "I thought we did that already," Mom said. "We did," Ava replied, "but things change." Her tone was patient, reassuring, perfect. I said nothing, because at that moment, nothing was technically wrong, and I had built an identity around not overreacting. Invisibility isn't just how others see you, it's how you train yourself to exist. I told myself I was being rational, balanced, mature, but looking back, that was the stage where my silence was still unconscious. I wasn't choosing it yet. I was simply playing the role they had written for me, the steady one, the practical one, the one who would never make a scene. And they were right about one thing. I wasn't going to make a scene, but I was going to notice everything. The first moment that unsettled me wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or obvious mistakes. It was a Tuesday afternoon, fluorescent lit and forgettable, the kind of day that disappears into the calendar. I had stopped by Mom's house after work. Ava's car was already in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see them at the table. Ava leaning forward, Mom sitting back, her shoulders slightly rounded. When I walked in, Ava smiled too quickly. "Hey Zoey, we were just going over Mom's new medication schedule." New. That word caught me. Mom had been on the same mild cognitive support medication for months. Nothing had changed at her last appointment. At least, not that I knew of. I set my bag down and leaned over the table casually. The pill organizer was open. The compartments for the evening doses looked fuller than usual. "Did Dr. Patel adjust something?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Ava answered before Mom could. "Just a slight increase. It'll help her rest better. She's been anxious." Mom nodded, but it was delayed, like she was confirming a script she'd just been handed. "I have been anxious," she said softly. That was the first small cut, not the medication itself. Adjustments happen. It was the way Ava controlled the narrative in real time. The way she answered questions was directed at our mother. The way Mom seemed to look to her for confirmation before speaking. I didn't challenge it, not then. Instead, I did what I always did. I observed. I picked up one of the prescription bottles and read the label. The dosage was indeed higher, prescribed 3 days ago. "I didn't realize there was another appointment," I said. "Oh, it was quick," Ava replied. "You're so busy, I didn't want to burden you." Burden. That word lingered longer than it should have. I worked in compliance. I reviewed medical documentation for a living. I knew how critical dosage changes could be, especially for elderly patients. "Did he mention side effects?" I asked. Ava sighed, just slightly, enough to signal impatience without appearing rude. "Zoey, it's fine, I'm handling it." Handling it? Mom reached for her tea, but her hand trembled more than usual. I noticed. Ava didn't, or maybe she did, and didn't react. Later that evening, when Ava stepped outside to take a call, I sat beside Mom on the couch. "How are you feeling, really?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. And for a second, she seemed clearer than she had all day. "Sleepy," she admitted, "but Ava says that's normal while I adjust." Adjust. It was subtle, the language shift, the dependency. I drove home that night with a quiet discomfort sitting in my chest. Not panic, not anger, just a thin line of doubt. The next morning, during my lunch break, I called Dr. Patel's office, not to accuse, just to verify. The nurse confirmed there had been a dosage increase. "Did Dr. Patel express concerns about rapid cognitive decline?" I asked carefully. There was a pause. "No, it was primarily for reported agitation and restlessness," she said. Reported. By whom? I thanked her and hung up. In isolation, nothing was criminal, nothing explosive. A daughter reporting anxiety, a doctor adjusting medication accordingly. Reasonable. But something about the timing unsettled me. 3 days before that appointment, Ava had mentioned the will again. "Mom's not getting younger," she'd said lightly over dinner. "We should make sure everything reflects her current wishes." Current wishes. At the time, I had nodded. Now the words felt heavier. That was the first small cut. Not evidence of wrongdoing, but the beginning of a pattern I couldn't unsee. And the most dangerous thing about subtle manipulation is that it hides behind plausibility. You question yourself before you question them. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself Ava loved Mom. I told myself I was overanalyzing because that's what I do for a living. But that night, I opened my black leather notebook for the first time regarding my own family. I wrote down the date, the medication change, the dosage, the phrasing Ava used. Not because I had proof of anything, but because something inside me had shifted from passive trust to quiet attention. And once you begin documenting, you are no longer just a bystander. You are preparing. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat quietly until you stop reacting to them. After that Tuesday, small dismissals began to layer themselves into daily life. Not dramatic enough to confront, not blatant enough to accuse, just subtle enough to condition everyone around them, including me. Ava started speaking for Mom more often. At follow-up appointments, she positioned her chair slightly closer to the doctor. When questions were asked, she answered first. Mom's been more confused in the evenings. She's having trouble remembering names. She gets overwhelmed easily. Each statement was delivered with calm authority, protective, concerned. And technically, none of it was entirely false. Mom did struggle more in the evenings. She did forget names occasionally. But I began noticing something strange. When I visited in the mornings, when Ava wasn't there, Mom seemed sharper. She'd recall details about her garden. She'd ask about my job. She'd even joke about how Ava worries too much. By late afternoon, especially after Ava had reorganized her pill case, Mom seemed slower, heavier in her movements. Her sentences trailed off. I brought it up once, carefully. Have you noticed Mom seems clearer earlier in the day? I asked over coffee. Ava stirred her cup slowly. That's how cognitive decline works, Zoey. You should know that. Mornings are better, evenings are worse. It was the way she said it, not confrontational, not aggressive, just corrective. As if I were naive, I felt that familiar role slide back into place, the practical one, the overthinker. So I nodded. That's how normalization works. You doubt your instincts because someone else sounds more certain. Then came the financial conversations. Mom had always been meticulous about her accounts. Balanced checkbooks by hand. Kept folders labeled by year. One afternoon, I asked casually, "Are you still reviewing your statements, Mom?" Ava answered from across the room, "It's easier if I manage that now. Too much paperwork stresses her out." Mom didn't object. She simply looked relieved. Relief is persuasive. It makes control look like kindness. The second small cut came when Ava laughed lightly at something I said. We were discussing the possibility of a second medical opinion. "I just think it wouldn't hurt to double-check medication interactions," I offered. Ava smiled, soft, patient. "Zoey, you're not her doctor." The room went quiet for half a second too long. Mom shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't the statement itself, it was the implication. Stay in your lane. You're useful, but not authoritative. I could have pushed back. I could have said I wasn't trying to be her doctor, just her daughter. But I didn't, because I had spent my entire life being the stabilizer. The one who doesn't escalate. The one who keeps peace. And peace in our family often meant silence. Over the next few weeks, Ava began casually referencing Mom's worsening state in conversations with extended relatives. "She's not as sharp as she used to be." It's heartbreaking, really. I'm just trying to protect her. Protect her? From what? From paperwork? From questions? From me? What unsettled me most wasn't just the medication. It was the narrative construction. Ava was building a story about our mother's decline, and repeating it often enough that others began accepting it as fact. And once a narrative settles into a group dynamic, challenging it makes you look unstable. I started noticing relatives directing logistical questions to Ava automatically. How's her memory now? Are there legal updates we should know about? Legal updates. The will had been quietly revised. I wasn't informed directly. I heard about it in passing. "Oh, Mom wanted to simplify things," Ava said one evening. Less confusion later. Less confusion for whom? When I asked to see the updated document, Ava hesitated just long enough for me to register it. "It's handled," she said gently. "You don't need to worry." You don't need to worry. It's a strange phrase. It sounds comforting, but it's also a boundary. It tells you your involvement is optional. That was when I realized something critical. The disrespect wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel. It was systematic. I was being edged out, not with hostility, but with politeness. And because it was polite, I had almost convinced myself it wasn't happening. Almost. But my notebook was filling. Dates, dosages, language shifts, timeline overlaps between medication increases and legal conversations. Still, I said nothing, because up until that point, my silence wasn't a strategy. It was a habit, and habits are harder to break than lies. There's a moment in every family system when you realize your role isn't accidental. It's assigned, not through a formal conversation, not through a vote, but through repetition, through reinforcement, through subtle rewards and quiet corrections until you internalize who you're allowed to be. By the time the will was revised, my role had crystallized. I was the dependable daughter, the financially stable one, the one who didn't need anything. Ava, on the other hand, had become the devoted caregiver, the emotionally present one, the indispensable one. At least that was the narrative. At a small family dinner one Sunday, our aunt leaned over to me while Ava helped Mom to the restroom. "You must be so grateful your sister has taken on so much," she whispered. "Grateful?" I smiled politely. "Of course." And in that moment, I understood something uncomfortable. If I expressed concern now, I wouldn't look protective. I would look ungrateful. That's how roles protect themselves. Ava began making more decisions without consultation. She switched Mom's primary bank to a branch closer to her apartment. She reorganized the filing cabinet to reduce clutter. She mentioned, almost casually, that she was now listed as the durable power of attorney. "Oh, Mom insisted," she said when I asked. Mom insisted. When I brought it up privately with Mom a few days later, her response was hazy. "I just signed what Ava said would make things easier," she murmured. "It's confusing, all the paperwork." Confusing. That word again. I sat there nodding, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not yet. It was the realization that my assigned role came with an expectation. I was not to disrupt the caregiver narrative. I was the secondary support, the backup, the stable presence that didn't demand recognition. At work, I was respected for catching inconsistencies in audit trails. My reports influenced policy changes. Executives took my findings seriously. At home, when I asked for transparency, I was met with gentle dismissal. "You worry too much. It's under control. You don't need to stress Mom out." It became clear that my questions were being reframed as threats. Not threats to Mom's well-being, threats to Ava's authority. One evening, after reviewing my notes, I realized something unsettling about myself. Part of me had accepted the invisibility because it felt safer. If I stayed in my lane, no one accused me of being dramatic. No one painted me as jealous. No one challenged my intentions. Confrontation would require me to step outside the identity I had carefully maintained for decades. And that identity, calm, steady, low conflict, had protected me in many ways. But it was also limiting me now. The real shift wasn't about the will. It wasn't even about the medication. It was about understanding that if I continued playing the assigned role, I would become complicit. Not actively, but passively. And passive complicity is still participation. I began noticing how Ava would physically position herself between Mom and me during serious discussions. How she would summarize conversations in ways that subtly excluded my input. When legal paperwork was mentioned, she would say, "I'll handle it," before I could respond, as if I were a distant relative, not a co-heir. The most telling moment came unexpectedly. Mom was having a particularly clear afternoon. We were sitting in her backyard, sunlight filtering through the trees. "Zoey," she said softly, "Ava says you're too busy to help much. I don't want to burden you." The words were gentle, but they landed like a weight. I wasn't too busy. I had offered multiple times to split responsibilities, to attend appointments, to review documents, but Ava had framed my professional stability as distance. In that instant, I understood the full shape of the role I'd been assigned. The successful but detached daughter, the one who didn't need involvement, the one who would accept whatever decisions were made for the best. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and realized something critical. If I wanted to protect her autonomy, I could no longer rely on being quietly competent. I would have to become quietly intentional. The role they assigned me was invisibility. The role I chose next would be observation, with purpose. And that difference changes everything. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't come from discovering a smoking gun or overhearing a confession. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the soft hum of my mother's kitchen. I had taken a half day off work. I didn't tell Ava, I didn't frame it as a statement. I simply wanted to sit with Mom without an agenda hovering in the room. When I arrived, Mom was alone. Ava had texted earlier saying she'd stop by in the evening to organize the week. Mom looked tired but alert. We made tea. She moved slowly but deliberately. There was no tremor in her hands that day. We sat at the small oak table where she used to help us with homework. For a while, we talked about simple things. Her roses, the neighbor's new fence. The weather is turning colder. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Zoey," she said, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear us through the walls. "Do you ever feel fuzzy?" The word stopped me. "Fuzzy how?" I asked gently. She pressed her fingers to her temples. "Like my thoughts are wrapped in cotton. Not all the time, but sometimes it's like I'm underwater." Underwater. I kept my face neutral, calm, no alarm. "When does it feel like that?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Usually after Ava fixes my pills." The sentence was simple, unaccusing, but something inside me aligned with a precision that felt almost physical. I didn't rush to conclusions. I didn't tell her what I suspected. I simply asked if I could see the medication bottles. We brought them to the table. I photographed the labels casually, framing it as helping her keep track. The dosages matched what I had written in my notebook. But I noticed something new. One of the sedatives, prescribed as needed for agitation, was nearly empty. It had been filled 10 days ago. 10 days. The instructions were conservative, low frequency, only during episodes of significant distress. "Have you been feeling agitated?" I asked carefully. She shook her head slowly. "I don't think so, I just get sleepy." Sleepy, underwater, and suddenly, all the small cuts formed a pattern that no longer felt abstract. It wasn't just narrative control, it was a chemical influence. I drove home that evening in complete silence. No music, no podcasts, just the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of my breathing. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this wasn't overprotectiveness. It was orchestration. And here's the part I didn't expect. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity, a strange cold clarity. If Ava was intentionally increasing sedation, subtly, plausibly, within the bounds of prescriptions, it would explain the fluctuating cognition, the increasing dependency, the urgency around updating legal documents. It would also explain why challenges to her narrative were gently dismissed, because the narrative depended on perceived decline. That night, I opened my notebook again, but the tone of my notes changed. Before, I had been documenting inconsistencies. Now, I have begun mapping timelines, medication refill dates, legal consultations, bank account changes, power of attorney filing. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was constructing a case. Not for court, not yet. For myself. Because once you allow your mind to accept that someone close to you might be manipulating reality, you can't afford emotional chaos. You need precision. The shift wasn't loud. It was internal. I stopped hoping I was wrong, and I started preparing in case I wasn't. I didn't confront Ava. I didn't accuse. I didn't warn. I watched. And for the first time in my life, my silence wasn't a habit. It was a decision. There's a difference between being quiet and choosing silence. For most of my life, I had been quiet because it was easier, because it kept the peace, because it allowed other people to feel larger without resistance. But after that Thursday afternoon in the kitchen, my silence changed texture. It became deliberate. I stopped challenging Ava in small ways. I stopped asking corrective questions in front of other people. I stopped reacting when she subtly redirected conversations. From the outside, it probably looked like I had accepted everything. And that was intentional, because when someone believes they've secured control, they relax. They stop covering their tracks as carefully. The following week, I visited during one of Ava's pill organizing sessions. I watched her hands closely, not suspiciously, just attentively. She moved with efficiency, confident, familiar. "Mom was restless last night," she said casually, dropping a tablet into the evening compartment. Mom didn't confirm it. She just sat there, docile, eyes slightly glazed. "Restless how?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Oh, just anxious, asking repetitive questions," Ava replied. "It's part of the progression." Progression. I noticed something subtle. The as-needed sedative was placed in multiple compartments, not just one. It was still within prescription parameters, technically defensible, but it wasn't occasional anymore. It was patterned. I said nothing. Instead, I began positioning myself differently. I offered to handle grocery runs more often. That gave me access to receipts and pharmacy bags. I volunteered to drive Mom to one follow-up appointment, framing it as giving Ava a break. Ava hesitated but agreed. At the clinic, I asked to review the medication list with the nurse under the guise of updating emergency contacts. When I compared the refill frequency to recommended usage, the discrepancy tightened my suspicions further. Still no explosion, still no accusation, just accumulation. What surprised me most was how quickly Ava interpreted my quiet as compliance. She began speaking more freely in front of me. "Mom gets confused about finances," she'd say lightly. "It's better if I consolidate everything." Consolidate. That word again, so clean, so responsible. Relatives stopped including me in logistical group texts. Instead, they'd ask Ava for updates directly. And I allowed it, because being excluded from conversations meant fewer variables, fewer chances for Ava to recalibrate her behavior in response to me. Silence creates space, and in that space, people reveal themselves. One evening, I stayed later than usual. Ava thought I had already left. I was in the hallway when I overheard her in the living room, speaking softly but firmly to Mom. "You don't need to stress about paperwork, okay? I've made sure everything reflects what you told me you wanted." A pause. "You trust me, right?" Mom's response was faint. "Of course. Trust is powerful, especially when one person is chemically less capable of questioning." That was the moment my silence solidified into a strategy. I wasn't going to argue about morality. I wasn't going to beg Ava to reconsider. If she were operating within the gray areas of legality, using prescribed medication, holding power of attorney, I would respond within those same systems. Calmly, precisely. At work, I handled cases where small documentation inconsistencies uncovered large-scale compliance violations. The key was never confrontation. It was verification. So I began requesting copies of documents under neutral pretenses. I just want everything organized in case of emergencies. Ava complied confidently. Confidence can be blinding. She didn't realize that I was comparing signatures across timelines, observing tremor variations, noting handwriting steadiness before and after dosage changes. I wasn't building a dramatic narrative. I was building evidence of influence. And the strangest part? The calmer I became, the more unsettled Ava seemed. Not overtly, but in micro-expressions, in the way her eyes lingered on me a second longer than before. Silence makes people project. They don't know what you're thinking. And that uncertainty disturbs them more than confrontation ever could. By the end of that month, I understood something with absolute certainty. If I was right, exposing this wouldn't require shouting. It would require patience. And patience has always been my strongest asset. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was watching, and she had no idea how carefully. Preparation never looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed when mine began. I didn't hire a private investigator. I didn't install cameras. I didn't accuse Ava of anything reckless. I did what I've always done best. I studied systems. The first system was medical. Through my compliance background, I understood something important. Doctors rely heavily on caregiver reporting when patients show cognitive fluctuation. If a caregiver repeatedly describes agitation, confusion, and anxiety, treatment is adjusted accordingly, not maliciously. Logically, so I requested Mom's full medication history through proper channels. As her daughter, I was legally allowed access, especially with power of attorney in place. I framed it as family record consolidation. The pharmacy provided refill timelines. The pattern was subtle but clear. The sedative labeled as needed had been refilled at intervals consistent with daily use. Not emergency use. Daily, still technically permissible, but inconsistent with the doctor's original intention. I created a timeline spreadsheet, something simple, clean, unemotional. Column A, refill dates. Column B, dosage strength. Column C, legal activity, will revision, bank consolidation, POA filing. Column D, observed cognitive state from my notes. Side by side, the alignment was unsettling. Each significant legal shift had followed a period of increased sedation, not immediately but within days. Correlation is not proof, but patterns demand attention. The second system was financial. I reviewed the updated will finally provided to me after I asked calmly, without accusation. It had changed significantly. Originally, the estate was evenly divided. The new version heavily favored Ava, citing her primary caregiving role and financial sacrifices. Financial sacrifices. Ava worked part-time by choice. She lived comfortably. There had been no major documented hardship. I didn't challenge the will directly. Instead, I compared signatures. I pulled older documents, birthday cards, prior legal paperwork, even handwritten recipes. Mom's handwriting before heavy sedation had a slight rightward slant. Firm pressure, consistent loops. The newer signature was shakier, lighter, slightly compressed. Not forged, but influenced. The third system was relational. I began increasing my presence, not aggressively but steadily. 3 visits a week, morning hours whenever possible. On days when I controlled the medication schedule, Mom was clearer, conversational, even humorous. I documented those days. Then during Ava's heavier management weeks, the fog returned. What they never noticed was that I wasn't trying to catch Ava in a dramatic mistake. I was creating contrast, because manipulation thrives in ambiguity. If you remove ambiguity, if you show 2 versions of reality side by side, truth becomes visible without confrontation. I also consulted, discreetly, with an elder law attorney. Not to file a complaint, not yet. I asked neutral questions. How is cognitive capacity evaluated in will revisions? What constitutes undue influence? How is medication impact assessed? The attorney's answers were measured. Undue influence requires proof of coercion or impaired judgment. Medical documentation matters. Witnesses matter. Timing matters. Timing, that word stayed with me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring equilibrium. If Ava had genuinely stepped into a caregiving role out of love, documentation would protect her too. But if she had shaped circumstances to manufacture dependency, documentation would reveal that as well. One afternoon, while reviewing pharmacy receipts, I noticed something Ava had overlooked. A duplicate refill request was submitted earlier than necessary, then canceled. The system time-stamped it. It suggested intent to increase supply. Small, almost insignificant. But it told me something about mindset. Preparation isn't loud. It's disciplined. And discipline requires emotional control. There were nights when I lay awake questioning myself. What if I was wrong? What if this was just protective overthinking? What if I destroyed my relationship with my sister over suspicion? But every time doubt surfaced, I returned to the same anchor. Mom describes her mind as underwater. That wasn't a metaphor you invent casually. By the end of those weeks, I had something I hadn't had before. Not proof of criminality, but proof of inconsistency. And in systems built on trust, inconsistency is enough to initiate a review. Ava still believed I was the quiet one, the uninvolved one, the stable but distant daughter. She didn't realize I was building a parallel narrative, one grounded not in emotion, but in documentation. And documentation doesn't argue, it waits. The truth didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrived as a quiet confirmation. Up until that point, I had patterns, timelines, inconsistencies that suggested influence. But I still lacked one critical element, medical clarity independent of Ava's reporting. So I scheduled a cognitive reassessment for Mom. Not behind anyone's back, I framed it simply. Mom, I'd love to get a second opinion, just to make sure your treatment plan is still the best fit. She agreed without resistance. Ava hesitated. Do we really need that? She asked, voice measured. Dr. Patel already knows her case. It's standard practice in compliance to validate changes, I replied calmly. It protects everyone. Protects everyone. That phrasing mattered. The appointment was set for a morning slot, before any medication adjustments beyond baseline prescriptions, and that detail changed everything. During the evaluation, Mom was lucid, engaged. She completed memory tasks with mild difficulty, yes, but nowhere near the level Ava had been describing. When asked about confusion or agitation, she paused. I get sleepy sometimes, she said, but I'm not sure why. The neurologist reviewed her medication list carefully. Who manages these dosages? He asked. Ava, Mom replied. He nodded thoughtfully. After running through the standard assessments, he stepped out briefly to consult his notes. When he returned, his tone was professional but precise. Based on today's evaluation, her cognitive decline appears mild to moderate, he said. However, the sedation level may be exacerbating symptoms. Exacerbating, a controlled word. He recommended tapering the as-needed sedative unless clear agitation episodes were documented. Has there been frequent agitation? He asked. I answered honestly. I haven't personally observed significant episodes during my visits. Ava shifted slightly in her chair. She gets worse in the evenings, she said quickly. That can happen, the doctor replied. But medication should align with observed severity. Observed. That word settled into the room like a weight. The doctor didn't accuse. He didn't suggest misconduct. But he acknowledged the possibility that medication could be intensifying impairment. That was my private reveal. Not a confession, not a scandal, a clinical acknowledgement that the fog might not be entirely organic. After the appointment, I drove Mom home myself. Ava claimed she had errands. When we reached the house, Mom looked at me differently. Did I do okay? She asked softly. You did, I said. You were clear. She smiled, faint but real. That afternoon, without confrontation, I requested updated pharmacy logs directly from the provider under the guise of reconciling dosage instructions post-evaluation. The neurologist's office documented the recommendation to reduce sedative use. Now I had something that shifted the balance. Before, I had suspicions. Now, I had a medical opinion suggesting overmedication could be contributing to perceived decline. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady, because leverage isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about restoring truth to its correct position. That evening, Ava texted me. Thanks for arranging the appointment. Let's discuss next steps soon. The wording was neutral, but beneath it, I sensed recalculation. For the first time, the system she had quietly built was encountering friction. Not confrontation. Friction. And friction generates heat over time. The inheritance hadn't been rewritten by love. It had been rewritten by control. Now control was beginning to loosen. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Privately. And privately is where real shifts begin. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because clarity changes your posture. And once you have it, you don't rush. You decide. Once you see clearly, you have to choose what kind of person you're going to be. Clarity is a gift, but it's also a burden. After the neurologist's evaluation, I had enough to disrupt Ava's structure. Don't destroy it, but challenge it formally. The question was how. There were multiple options. Option 1, confront Ava directly, present the refill patterns. The doctor's recommendation, The timeline overlap between increased sedation and legal revisions. That path would have been emotionally satisfying for about 5 minutes, and then it would have collapsed into denial. She would frame it as a misunderstanding, as concern misinterpreted, as me overstepping. Option 2. Escalate. Escalate immediately. Report suspected overmedication to Adult Protective Services. Initiate an investigation. Legally viable. But investigations are blunt instruments. They introduce chaos. They humiliate. They create irreversible fractures. And I wasn't trying to punish my sister. I was trying to protect my mother. Option 3. Quietly restore balance. Adjust the medication oversight. Reevaluate cognitive capacity under stabilized conditions. Review the validity of the revised will based on documented sedation impact. Not revenge. Correction. The irreversible choice wasn't about attacking Ava. It was about stepping fully into authority. For most of my life, I had avoided claiming authority within my family. It felt unnatural, disruptive. But now avoiding it would mean surrendering Mom's autonomy. That was the real decision point. One evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my notebook open. On one page, I listed risks. The relationship with Ava is permanently altered. Extended family backlash, accusations of jealousy or control, emotional fallout. On the other page, I listed the consequences of inaction. Continued sedation, legal documents executed under compromised cognition, permanent asset redistribution, Mom's autonomy diminished. The second list was heavier, not emotionally. Ethically, the inheritance itself didn't matter to me in the way people assume it would. I was financially stable. I didn't depend on it. But the mechanism mattered. If the will had been rewritten under conditions of chemical impairment, engineered or encouraged, that wasn't just unfair. It was coercive. And coercion disguised as care is the most dangerous kind. The irreversible choice I made wasn't loud. I scheduled a formal capacity evaluation under stabilized medication conditions. I didn't ask Ava for permission. As co-heir and immediate family, I had the right to request an independent assessment, especially following a medical recommendation to adjust sedation. Then I contacted the elder law attorney again. If cognitive capacity improves under reduced medication, I asked, can a prior will revision be contested on grounds of undue influence? The answer was careful. Yes, particularly if medication may have impaired judgment at the time of execution. Medication, impairment, timing, the pieces aligned. This wasn't about courtroom drama. It was about documentation that would allow the truth to stand without theatrics. The irreversible part wasn't legal. It was relational. Once I initiated a formal review of Mom's capacity and medication oversight, Ava would understand what I was doing. She would know I no longer accepted her narrative. There would be no going back to being the agreeable sister. I slept calmly that night, because for the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to Ava's moves. I was defining the board. And defining the board means you're ready for consequences. Not revenge. Consequences. Once I made the decision, I moved the way I always do, methodically. No announcements, no emotional declarations. No, we need to talk. Just action. The neurologist adjusted Mom's medication according to his recommendation. The sedative was restricted strictly to documented agitation episodes. I offered calmly to share oversight of the medication schedule to reduce stress on Ava. She resisted at first. I've been handling it just fine, she said. I know, I replied evenly. This just aligns with the doctor's updated plan. Doctor's plan. Not my concern, not my suspicion. Clinical guidance. Reluctantly, she agreed to alternate weeks. That change alone shifted the atmosphere. During my weeks managing the medication, Mom's clarity improved noticeably. Not dramatically, but measurably. She completed crossword puzzles again. She initiated conversations. She even asked about reviewing some of her financial files herself. That detail mattered. I documented everything. Dates, behavioral observations, sleep patterns, appetite changes. Nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional. Just contrast. At the same time, I quietly filed a petition for an independent cognitive capacity evaluation specific to legal decision-making. This wasn't a public accusation. It was a protective measure, standard when significant estate changes occur amid documented medical fluctuation. The attorney guided the wording carefully. The request cited recent medication adjustments, documented sedation concerns, desire to confirm sustained capacity for legal clarity, not misconduct. Clarity. Ava wasn't notified immediately. The evaluation was scheduled through proper legal channels. When she did receive notice, it was procedural. She called me that evening. Her tone was composed but tighter than usual. Why didn't you tell me you were doing this? She asked. I'm ensuring Mom's wishes are protected long term, I said calmly. If everything was done properly, this only strengthens it. That was true. If the will revision had occurred under unimpaired cognition, a new evaluation would validate it. Silence followed. She couldn't argue against protection. That's the thing about moving within systems instead of outside them. Resistance becomes difficult. Meanwhile, I reviewed bank activity through the access Mom legally granted both of us. There were no large transfers, no blatant theft, but there were structural changes. Account consolidations, beneficiary updates, and reclassification of certain assets as joint convenience accounts. Again, technically permissible, but strategically advantageous. I flagged them in my documentation, not as accusations but as context. Then I did something Ava didn't anticipate. I spent time simply sitting with Mom, asking neutral questions about her wishes. Not leading, not prompting. Do you remember updating the will? Yes, she said slowly. Ava said it made sense. Did you want it changed significantly? She frowned slightly. I don't remember the details. That wasn't evidence of coercion, but it was important. Memory gaps around critical legal decisions matter. The capacity evaluation took place 2 weeks later under stabilized medication conditions. Mom performed consistently within the mild cognitive impairment range, but demonstrated a clear understanding of her assets, her heirs, the implications of unequal distribution. When asked directly whether she felt pressured during prior revisions, she hesitated. I trust my daughters, she said. That answer was neutral. But the evaluator noted improved clarity compared to previous medical reports. Improved clarity. Documented. Ava became quieter after that. Not confrontational, just observant. She sensed the shift, but couldn't identify the weak point in her structure because I hadn't attacked it. I had reinforced it with transparency. And transparency, when introduced into a controlled system, forces adjustment. Others still saw nothing dramatic. No fights, no shouting matches, just two daughters navigating their mother's care. What they didn't see was the recalibration happening beneath the surface. Control depends on fog. I was removing the fog gradually, and the consequences were beginning to gather, not explosively, inevitably. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They unfold in shifts, subtle at first, uneven, disorienting. After the medication adjustment and the independent capacity evaluation, the atmosphere in Mom's house changed. Not dramatically, just lighter. Mom began initiating small acts of independence again. She sorted old photographs one afternoon without prompting. She asked for her checkbook back, not defensively, just matter of fact. I'd like to look at a few things myself, she said. Ava handed it over with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That was the first consequence. Control requires dependency. Clarity weakens dependency. The second consequence appeared socially. Relatives who had grown accustomed to Ava's updates started receiving messages from Mom directly. Short texts, simple check-ins. Thinking of you. The garden is blooming. It was minor, but it disrupted the narrative of rapid decline. Ava's tone during family calls shifted subtly. She's having a good week, she would say, but it fluctuates. She was recalibrating the story. Meanwhile, the elder law attorney formally requested a review of the prior will revision timeline in light of updated medical documentation. Not an accusation, a procedural inquiry. Ava called me again. You're making this complicated, she said quietly. I'm making it clear, I replied. Silence. That word, clear, landed harder than any insult. Because clarity implies that something was previously obscured. Mom, during this period, seemed more observant than either of us expected. One evening, she looked at both of us and said, I don't want you two fighting over me. We weren't fighting. That was the unsettling part. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, just structural adjustments. The pharmacy logs were reviewed by the neurologist's office after I requested a dosage audit under the guise of optimizing care. The documentation showed frequent use of the sedative, inconsistent with documented agitation episodes. No criminal charges, no dramatic interventions. But a formal note was added to Mom's medical record recommending stricter monitoring. Stricter monitoring. That phrase alone altered Ava's freedom of movement. She was no longer the sole narrative source for Mom's symptoms. Medical professionals began asking more direct questions during appointments. Has she been sedated outside prescribed parameters? Who is overseeing administration? Oversight had expanded. That was the third consequence. Then came the legal ripple. The capacity evaluation concluded that while Mom had mild cognitive impairment, her decision-making ability improved significantly under stabilized medication. The attorney advised that any major legal revisions executed during periods of potential oversedation warranted reevaluation. Reevaluation, not invalidation, not an accusation, just scrutiny. Ava grew quieter. She stopped over-explaining, stopped narrating every symptom. Because scrutiny changes behavior, the most telling consequence wasn't external. It was internal. For the first time in years, I felt aligned. Not anxious, not reactive. Aligned. I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't trying to expose. I was allowing systems to self-correct under light. And light doesn't need to shout. One afternoon, I arrived to find Mom reviewing the revised will with the attorney present, something Ava had previously managed alone. "I want to understand this better," Mom said calmly. Ava sat across the table, composed but still. The inheritance hadn't been rewritten by love. It had been rewritten by control. Now, control was facing review, not punishment. Review. And review is uncomfortable when you've grown used to operating without it. The consequences had begun, quietly, and there was no way to reverse that momentum. By the time Ava realized the structure was no longer stable, it was already too late to restore it to what it had been. Control, once questioned, never regains its original authority. The legal review moved forward, not as a scandal, not as a public dispute, but as a procedural correction. The attorney met privately with Mom on multiple occasions, ensuring conversations occurred without either daughter present. That alone shifted the dynamic. When you remove influence from the room, clarity changes shape. Mom began asking different questions. Why was it divided this way? Did I understand everything fully? Was I feeling well that week? She wasn't accusing Ava. She wasn't accusing me. She was reassessing herself. That's the part Ava hadn't anticipated. Influence can steer decisions. But once a person regains confidence in their own cognition, they start reviewing those decisions independently. And independence is difficult to recontain. Ava tried subtle recalibration. She became overly attentive again, soft-spoken, supportive. "I just want whatever makes Mom comfortable," she'd say during meetings. But the tone had shifted. There was a faint urgency beneath it. Medical documentation now reflected that sedation had likely intensified cognitive fog during the period the will was revised. Not conclusively, not criminally, but sufficiently to warrant reconsideration. The attorney recommended a voluntary re-execution of the will under medically documented stabilized conditions to eliminate any future disputes. Voluntary. That word mattered. No court battle, no allegations, just a clean slate. Mom agreed. Ava didn't argue, but the silence around her was heavier than before. The inheritance wasn't automatically restored to its original equal distribution. That's what people assume when they hear stories like this, that justice means perfect symmetry. It didn't. Instead, Mom adjusted it thoughtfully, deliberately. She acknowledged Ava's caregiving contributions, but she also clarified asset division with new provisions to ensure transparency and oversight moving forward. More importantly, she restructured the power of attorney to require dual consent for major financial decisions. Dual consent. That was irreversible. It meant Ava would never again operate independently over medical or financial decisions. The panic didn't look like shouting. It looked like a subtle withdrawal, shorter conversations, avoided eye contact, a careful distance. Because Ava understood something even if she never said it aloud. The system she had constructed, caregiver authority, narrative control, legal leverage, had been dismantled without a single public accusation. And once dismantled, it couldn't be rebuilt, not without visible resistance. Relatives sensed tension but never received details. There were updates to ensure clarity, Mom would say gently. Clarity. That word had become the foundation of everything. One evening, after a meeting with the attorney concluded, Ava lingered in the hallway while Mom rested. "You think I was trying to manipulate her?" she said quietly. It wasn't phrased as a question. I looked at her. "I think sedation affected her more than you acknowledged," I replied calmly. "And legal decisions should be made when she's fully present." She didn't deny increasing the medication frequency. She didn't confirm it either. She just exhaled slowly. "You always did think in systems," she murmured. And that was the closest she ever came to admitting awareness. The panic wasn't explosive. It was the realization that the leverage was gone. And once leverage disappears, control becomes ordinary. Ordinary caregiving, ordinary sibling dynamics, ordinary oversight. Nothing dramatic, just balanced. And balance, once restored, makes the prior imbalance obvious. By then, it truly was too late to fix what had been attempted. Not because I destroyed it, but because clarity had replaced fog. And fog, once lifted, never returns the same way twice. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't happen at the attorney's office. It happened in my mother's kitchen, where most truths in our family had always quietly surfaced. Mom was resting upstairs. The house was unusually still. Late afternoon light filtered through the curtains, soft but unforgiving. Ava stood by the sink, hands braced against the counter. "I need to understand something," she said, not looking at me. "When did you decide I couldn't be trusted?" Her tone wasn't angry. It was controlled, measured, the way mine usually was. "I took a seat at the table. I didn't decide you couldn't be trusted," I said calmly. I decided Mom deserved decisions made when she was fully alert. She turned then. You think I drugged her? The word hung in the air. I didn't flinch. I think the sedative was used more frequently than medically necessary. And I think that influenced timing. Silence. No raised voices, no accusations thrown back. Just truth stated plainly. Ava's jaw tightened slightly. She was anxious, she said. She was deteriorating. I was there every day. You weren't. That's fair, I replied. You were there more. That acknowledgement shifted something. She hadn't expected a concession. But being present, I continued gently, doesn't mean decisions can't be reviewed. Her eyes softened just a fraction. I gave up time, opportunities, she said. I rearranged my life. I know, I said, and I meant it. Caregiving is heavy. It's exhausting. It changes you. But exhaustion doesn't justify influence. I never wanted to hurt her, Ava said quietly. I don't think you wanted to, I replied. And that was the truth. Intent and impact are different things. For the first time, the dynamic between us felt level. Not because she admitted wrongdoing, not because I proved superiority, but because the narrative had equalized. She could no longer position herself as the sole protector, and I was no longer the detached observer. We were two daughters standing in the aftermath of a correction. I thought you didn't care about the inheritance, she said. I don't, I answered. I care about how it was decided. That distinction mattered. Money fades, documentation fades, but autonomy, once compromised, is difficult to restore. Ava sank into the chair across from me. You always move so quietly, she said. I've always been quiet, I replied. She shook her head slightly. No, not quiet, strategic. It wasn't admiration, but it wasn't hostility either, just recognition. There were no apologies, no dramatic reconciliations, because real confrontation isn't about winning. It's about clarity standing without aggression. I guess we'll have to figure out how to do this together now, she said finally. Yes, I said. Dual consent, shared oversight, transparent systems. That was the new reality. The inheritance had been rewritten once by control. Now it existed under a structure. As Ava left that evening, there was no slammed door, just a quiet understanding. The power imbalance was gone, and neither of us needed to raise our voices to acknowledge it. If you had met me a year ago, you would have described me the same way everyone always did. Calm, reliable, low drama. That hasn't changed. What has changed is what that calmness means. Before, my quiet was accommodation. Now, it's alignment. Mom's condition stabilized under monitored medication. Some days are clearer than others, but the fog that once felt artificial no longer lingers the same way. She manages small financial decisions herself again. Larger ones require both Ava's and my signatures. Dual consent didn't just restructure paperwork. It restructured identity. Ava and I operate differently now. We coordinate appointments, we exchange notes, we don't overstep. There are moments of tension, but they're practical, not personal. Something subtle shifted between us after that kitchen conversation. She no longer performs caregiving in front of me, and I no longer shrink to avoid conflict. We both occupy space more honestly. The inheritance remains adjusted but transparent, documented under stabilized capacity, reviewed in neutral settings. No drama, just clarity. People sometimes assume quiet dominance means overpowering someone without noise. It doesn't. It means refusing to surrender truth simply because expressing it might be uncomfortable. For most of my life, I thought strength required visible assertion. What I learned instead is that strength can look like documenting when others dismiss, waiting when others rush, acting within systems instead of against them, protecting without humiliating. I didn't destroy my sister. I didn't expose her publicly. I didn't seek punishment. I restored balance, and balance is often mistaken for retaliation by people who were benefiting from the imbalance. The biggest shift, though, was internal. I no longer accept invisibility as my role, not because I need recognition, but because silence without intention is surrender. Silence with intention is a strategy. I still carry my black leather notebook. It's no longer filled with defensive documentation. It's filled with reminders. That clarity doesn't need volume. That truth doesn't require spectacle. That protection doesn't require cruelty. The inheritance wasn't rewritten by love. It was rewritten by control. But control, when exposed to steady light, dissolves. And I learned something else. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It's leverage if you know how to use it. I am still the steady one, still the calm one. But now when I walk into a room, I don't sit at the edges of conversations about decisions that matter. I sit at the table, not loudly, not aggressively, just firmly. And that has made all the difference. When people hear a story like this, they often expect a villain. Someone dramatic, cruel, calculating in obvious ways. But most control doesn't look like that. It looks like care is slightly intensified, protection slightly exaggerated, help slightly overextended. And slowly, almost invisibly, someone else's autonomy shrinks. I found out my sister had been drugging our mother to manipulate her into changing the will. But the truth is more complicated than that single sentence. There was no malicious mastermind. There was exhaustion. There was fear. There was an opportunity. And there was a system that allowed subtle influence to hide inside good intentions. The inheritance wasn't rewritten by love. It was rewritten by control. And control thrives in fog. What saved my mother's autonomy wasn't rage. It wasn't exposure. It wasn't revenge. It was documentation. It was patience. It was stepping into authority without theatrics. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about refusing to let truth be distorted simply because distortion is more convenient. In the end, nothing exploded. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic court scenes, no public humiliation. There was just clarity. And clarity has weight. My relationship with my sister is different now. More honest, less performative. My relationship with myself is different too. I no longer confuse being peaceful with being passive. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. You don't have to become loud to become powerful. You don't have to destroy someone to correct a system. And you don't have to accept invisibility just because it's familiar. Sometimes the strongest move is the quiet one, made early enough to prevent irreversible harm. I'm curious, if you had discovered something like this in your own family, would you have confronted it loudly or moved in silence?